Hello everyone, welcome to the Story Tales, your place for the best horror stories. For the next hour, I want you to put on your earphones, put your phone face down, and close your eyes. Relax, and let this story take you to a world full of chills and mystery. I've been listening to horror stories for years, and now I'm here to share the most amazing ones with you. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. It all began on a quiet, cloudy afternoon. The kind of day where everything feels a little too still, like the air is holding its breath. I had just moved into this old, creaky house with my dad in a place called Willow Creek. It's far from the city, surrounded by woods so thick that sunlight barely touches the ground. The house was huge but felt wrong, like it didn't want us there. The windows were tall and dusty, the doors groaned when they moved, and the floors were always cold, no matter how warm the day was. My room was on the second floor, but it didn't feel safe, not even with the lock on the door. But the scariest part of the house wasn't upstairs, it was the basement. The basement door was thick and wooden, with black metal hinges that looked ancient. It was heavy, too, and creaked loudly every time you opened it. A single bulb dangled from a thin wire at the bottom of the stairs, barely lighting the cold stone room below. The air down there smelled damp, like wet dirt and rusty nails. I hated going down there, but Dad always said it was just a room, nothing more. That afternoon, I was in the basement, helping to move boxes. Most of them were full of old tools, winter coats, and things we didn't use anymore. I was stacking them in the corner when I heard it. A voice. At first, I thought I imagined it. It was so soft, like someone whispering my name from far away. Ma'ark. I froze, my heart thudding like a drum in my chest. The voice came again, a little louder this time. Mark! It came from the darkest corner of the basement, the spot where the single light bulb didn't reach. I stared at the shadowy wedge where the stone walls met. My hands were shaking so much I almost dropped the box I was holding. Dad? I called, my voice trembling. But there was no answer. I swallowed hard and tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just the wind slipping through the cracks in the old walls. Maybe I was just hearing things. But it didn't feel like the wind. I forced myself to keep stacking the boxes, even though my legs felt weak. I told myself to stop being silly. But the voice stayed in my head, like an itch I couldn't scratch. That night I tried to tell Dad about it. We were sitting in the small kitchen, eating sandwiches. I told him how I heard my name, how it sounded like it came from the corner of the basement. It's just an old house, Dad said, waving it off. Old houses make weird noises. You're imagining things. But it felt real, I said, gripping my sandwich tightly. It didn't sound like the house. It sounded like someone was down there. Dad gave me a tired look. Mark, there's nobody in the basement. Just keep your mind on other things, okay? I nodded, but I didn't feel any better. That night I stayed awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Every creak of the house made me flinch. Every gust of wind against the windows sounded like whispers. The next morning, I went back down to the basement to finish moving the boxes. I was nervous, but I told myself it was just an empty room. I had to be brave. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the first thing I noticed was that the boxes I had stacked the day before were different. They weren't where I had left them. Instead of being in neat rows against the wall, they were spread out across the floor, arranged in a strange shape. It looked like a circle, but parts of it were broken, like someone had started to draw something and stopped halfway. I stared at the boxes, my skin crawling. Dad? I called again, even though I knew he wasn't home. The basement was silent, except for the faint drip of water somewhere in the distance. I wanted to run back upstairs, but I couldn't move. It felt like the basement was watching me, waiting for me to do something. I bent down and started moving the boxes back into place. My hands were sweaty, and I kept looking over my shoulder. The shadows in the corner seemed darker than before, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then I heard it again. "Ma'ark." This time it was louder, and it didn't sound far away. It sounded like it was right behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding. The flashlight I had brought with me was shaking in my hand. I pointed it at the dark corner, but there was nothing there. Just the cold, damp walls. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The shadows didn't move. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of water. I ran upstairs, slamming the basement door behind me. I grabbed a heavy chair from the dining room and shoved it against the door. My hands were shaking, and my breath came in short, sharp gasps. For the rest of the day, I stayed out of the basement. I tried to play video games, watch TV, and even read a book, but I couldn't focus. Every time I heard a noise, I jumped. That night, I dreamed about the basement. In my dream, I was standing at the bottom of the stairs, staring at the dark corner. The boxes were back in that strange circle, and the single light bulb flickered weakly. The voice came again, louder this time. "Ma'ark! Ma'ark!" I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The shadows in the corner seemed to grow, stretching toward me like black smoke. When I woke up, my pillow was damp with sweat, and my heart was racing. I looked around my room, but everything was still. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioner. I told myself it was just a dream, but I couldn't stop thinking about the voice. The next morning, I found the basement door open. The chair I had pushed against it was on the floor, like someone had moved it. My stomach dropped and my hands started to sweat. I peered down the stairs, but the basement was silent. The light bulb at the bottom was still on, casting a pale yellow glow over the stone floor. I wanted to tell Dad, but he had already left for work. I was alone in the house. For the rest of the day, I stayed as far from the basement as I could. But no matter where I went, I felt like the voice was following me. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps. Every rustle of the wind sounded like someone whispering my name. By the time night fell, I was too scared to sleep. I sat in the living room, staring at the basement door. It felt like it was staring back at me. And then, just as the clock struck midnight, I heard it again. "Ma'ark." It was louder than before, almost a growl. I froze, clutching the edge of the couch. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the basement, the walls, the air around me. And then I heard something else, the sound of footsteps coming up the basement stairs. I stared at the basement door, my breath caught in my throat. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. Each one sent a shiver crawling down my spine. The wooden stairs groaned under the weight of something, or someone, coming up. I wanted to move, to run, to scream for help, but my legs felt like they were bolted to the floor. The only thing I could do was watch the door, hoping, praying, that it wouldn't open. The footsteps stopped. The silence was worse than the sound. For what felt like forever, nothing happened. The air around me was so heavy I could hardly breathe. My eyes stayed fixed on the doorknob, waiting for it to turn. And then it did. The brass knob twisted slowly, the metal groaning like it hadn't been touched in years. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I wanted to scream for Dad even though I knew he wasn't home. I wanted to grab something, anything to defend myself. But I couldn't move. The door opened just a crack. Beyond it, the basement stairs disappeared into darkness. The faint glow of the light bulb was gone, leaving nothing but a yawning black void. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice shaking. No answer. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. "I know you're there," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "You can't scare me." The door creaked wider, revealing more of the darkness. The air spilling out of the basement was icy cold, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic, like blood. That's when I saw it. A shape emerged from the darkness just beyond the doorway. It was hard to see, just a shadow at first, but then it began to take form. It was tall and thin, with long, bony arms that seemed too long for its body. Its head was misshapen, tilted at an unnatural angle. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its eyes on me. "Mark." The voice was deeper now, almost guttural, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. I stumbled backward, my legs finally responding. My foot caught on the edge of the coffee table, and I fell, hitting the floor hard. The shadow moved closer, stepping into the faint light of the living room. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I just ran, bolting up the stairs to my room. I slammed the door shut and locked it, pressing my back against it. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath. For a moment, everything was silent. Then came the sound of footsteps again, this time on the stairs leading up to the second floor. It was coming for me. I looked around the room, desperate for something to protect myself. My eyes landed on my baseball bat, leaning against the wall by my bed. I grabbed it and gripped it tightly, my palms slick with sweat. The footsteps stopped outside my door. I held my breath, listening. The doorknob rattled. "Go away!" I shouted, raising the bat. "I'm warning you!" The rattling stopped. For a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Then slowly, the shadow beneath the door began to move. It stretched across the floor, twisting and writhing like smoke. I swung the bat at the door, shouting as loud as I could. The shadow froze, then slithered back under the door. Everything went still. I waited, clutching the bat, my hands trembling. Minutes passed, but the shadow didn't return. Eventually, I worked up the courage to open the door. I peeked out into the hallway, but it was empty. The house was silent again. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Dad found me in the kitchen, sitting at the table with dark circles under my eyes. I was still holding the baseball bat. "Mark, what's going on?" he asked, pouring himself a cup of coffee. I didn't know how to explain it. How could I tell him about the shadow, the voice, the thing that had crawled out of the basement? "You wouldn't believe me," I muttered. "Try me," he said, sitting down across from me. I hesitated, then told him everything. About the voice, the footsteps, the shadow. I told him how the basement door opened on its own, how something had come up the stairs. Dad listened quietly, his face unreadable. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and let out a long sigh. "Mark," he said, rubbing his temples. "It's an old house. It makes noises. Shadows look strange at night. Your imagination is running wild." "But it wasn't my imagination," I insisted. "I saw it, Dad. It was real." He shook his head. "There's no such thing as monsters, Mark. You're just scaring yourself." I wanted to argue, but I could tell he wouldn't believe me. He thought I was just being a kid, making things up. That afternoon, Dad went down to the basement to check it out. I stayed at the top of the stairs, clutching the baseball bat. "It's fine," he called up after a few minutes. "Nothing down here but boxes and cobwebs." He came back up, shaking his head. "You need to stop worrying so much. The basement is just a basement." But I knew better. That night I stayed awake again, listening to the house. Every creak, every gust of wind made me jump. Around midnight, I heard it. "Mark." The voice was fainter this time, but it was still there. It sent a chill down my spine. I grabbed the baseball bat and crept out of my room. The hallway was dark, lit only by the moonlight streaming through the windows. The voice came again, leading me toward the basement. I knew I shouldn't go. I knew it was dangerous. But something about the voice pulled at me, like it was reaching inside my head and dragging me forward. When I reached the basement door, it was already open. The stairs disappeared into darkness, just like before. "Mark." The voice was clearer now, louder. It was calling to me from the bottom of the stairs. I gripped the bat tightly and took a deep breath. Then, step by step, I started down. The air grew colder with each step. The smell of damp earth was stronger now, almost suffocating. When I reached the bottom, the light bulb flickered to life on its own. The basement was empty, just like Dad had said. But the boxes were back in that strange circle, and in the middle of the circle was something new. A small, black book lay open on the floor. Its pages were covered in strange symbols and drawings, twisted shapes that made my head hurt just looking at them. I knelt down, my hands trembling, and reached for the book. As soon as my fingers touched it, the room went dark. The darkness swallowed me whole. The air turned icy, and the faint, damp smell of the basement was replaced by something far worse, a stench of decay and burnt metal that made my stomach churn. My fingers clenched around the book instinctively, as if letting it go would seal my fate. Then the voice came again. "Mark." It was everywhere, echoing in the pitch-black void. This time, it wasn't calling from a distance. It was close. Too close. A flicker of light suddenly appeared, a faint, bluish glow, like a candle struggling against the wind. It came from the book in my hands, the symbols on the pages starting to shimmer and pulse. I could make out the faint shapes of the basement walls, though they seemed warped, as if the room itself was bending and twisting unnaturally. "Who are you?" I shouted into the darkness, trying to sound braver than I felt. "What do you want from me?" For a moment there was no response. Then the voice spoke again, and this time it was clear, sharp, and deeply inhuman. "I am bound. You have the key." The book in my hands flared brighter, the symbols glowing like molten metal. The heat seared my palms, but I couldn't bring myself to drop it. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking. The darkness seemed to ripple, and the faint light revealed the shadowy figure from before, its grotesque form now more solid, more real. Its head tilted at an impossible angle as it regarded me with hollow, empty eyes. "You opened the door, Mark," it said, its voice a guttural rasp. "Now you must close it." The air grew colder still, and the glow of the book illuminated the circle of boxes around me. But now, the boxes weren't empty. Each one was filled with something horrific. Bones, rusted tools, blackened scraps of fabric that reeked of death. "What door?" I demanded. "What are you talking about?" The figure stepped closer, its long, bony arms reaching out toward me. I stumbled back, my foot kicking one of the boxes and sending its contents spilling across the floor. "The book is a key," it hissed. "You must read the words. Speak them aloud. Only then will the door close." The book in my hands seemed to hum with energy, its pages flipping wildly on their own. The symbols shifted and twisted, forming words that I could somehow understand, even though they were written in a language I'd never seen before. I glanced back at the shadowy figure. What happens if I don't? It smiled, or at least, I thought it did. The corners of its twisted mouth curled upward in a way that made my stomach turn. "Then I will be free." I didn't have a choice. Whatever this thing was, whatever it wanted, I couldn't let it escape. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling as I began to read the words aloud. The moment the first syllable left my lips, the air around me seemed to vibrate. The walls of the basement shimmered, and the ground beneath my feet began to crack. A low, guttural roar echoed through the space, drowning out my voice for a moment. But I kept going. The words spilled from my mouth, faster and faster, as if the book was guiding me. The glow from its pages grew brighter, illuminating the entire basement. The boxes began to shake violently, their horrific contents spilling out onto the floor. The shadowy figure recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. It let out a deafening screech, its long arms clawing at the air as if trying to hold on to something. "You cannot stop this," it roared. "You are too late." I didn't stop. The words kept coming, each one feeling heavier, more powerful than the last. The cracks in the floor widened, revealing a swirling vortex of darkness beneath. It pulsed with a malevolent energy, like a black hole ready to consume everything. The shadowy figure was being pulled toward it, its form stretching and distorting as it fought against the pull. "You think this will end me?" It spat, its voice filled with rage. "You are merely delaying the inevitable. There are others, Mark. Others who will finish what you started." I ignored its words and kept reading. The light from the book was blinding now, the symbols on the pages burning into my mind. The vortex below roared like a hurricane, its pull growing stronger with every passing second. The shadow let out one final ear-piercing scream before it was sucked into the abyss. The vortex collapsed in on itself, and the room was plunged into silence. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the basement floor. The book was gone, and the boxes were nothing more than piles of ash. The basement looked normal again. Dirty, cluttered, but normal. I sat up slowly, my head pounding. The air was still cold, but the oppressive darkness was gone. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator upstairs and the distant sound of cars passing on the street. It was over, or so I thought. The next few days were quiet. Dad didn't notice anything strange, and I didn't tell him about what had happened. He wouldn't have believed me anyway. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. At night, I would wake up to faint whispers, barely audible but always there. Shadows seemed to linger in the corners of my room, darker and thicker than they should have been. One night, I found a single page from the book under my pillow. The symbols on it were faint, almost faded, but I recognized them immediately. The words burned into my mind. "The door is never truly closed." I stared at the page, my heart sinking. The shadowy figure's final words echoed in my mind. There are others. The book might be gone, and the basement might be just a basement again, but I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. It all started on a cold, foggy night when I decided to leave the city and move into a house that felt more like a relic from another time than a home. I needed a change. My life in Chicago had become a blur of missed deadlines and sleepless nights, all consumed by my obsession with painting. My art felt stuck, and so did I. When I found the listing for this old house tucked away in the small, forgotten town of Dunewood, I felt an odd pull toward it. The house stood at the edge of a dense forest, its frame leaning slightly as if weighed down by the years it had witnessed. It was a 2-story structure, with faded wooden shingles and a sagging porch. The windows were large, their glass stained with streaks of grime, giving the house an uninviting gaze. Something about its isolation and worn beauty called to me, like it was waiting for someone to bring it back to life. Or perhaps it was the other way around. I arrived just before sunset, with only a suitcase and a few boxes of art supplies. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, and the silence of the place was unsettling. The real estate agent handed me the keys with a nervous smile, her eyes darting toward the house, as though she didn't want to linger too long. "You'll find everything you need inside," she said quickly, before practically jogging back to her car. I stood there, staring at the house, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. "It's just an old house," I told myself. Nothing more. The interior was exactly as I expected. Dim, dusty, and cluttered with remnants of a life long forgotten. Sheets covered most of the furniture, and the wooden floors groaned under my weight. The house felt heavy, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something, or someone. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent my days setting up my atelier in what used to be the sitting room. The room had high ceilings and large windows that let in just enough light to work by, though the sunlight always seemed muted, as if the house swallowed it before it could fully brighten the space. My easel stood near one of the windows, surrounded by canvases and jars of paint. At night, the house came alive in a different way. The floorboards creaked, the walls groaned, and the wind seemed to whisper through the cracks. I dismissed it as my imagination, or the house settling, as old houses often do. But then came the fourth night. I woke up with a start, my heart pounding and my skin damp with sweat. For a moment, I didn't recognize where I was. The room felt foreign, the shadows on the walls unfamiliar. It took me a few seconds to remember I was in the house I had rented, far from the noise and chaos of the city. The clock on my bedside table glowed a dull red, 3:14 a.m. I lay there trying to steady my breathing. My eyes felt dry, and my legs ached from standing at the easel for hours earlier. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, like a presence in the room I couldn't see. The air felt colder than it should have, given that all the windows were shut. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, but it didn't help. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, like footsteps, distant but distinct. I sat up, straining to hear. The house was silent again, but the unease in my chest grew stronger. Telling myself I was being ridiculous, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up. My body felt heavy, and my head throbbed lightly, but I couldn't ignore the urge to check the house. The wooden floor was cold under my bare feet as I made my way to the kitchen. I filled a glass with water and stood by the sink, staring at my reflection in the window. The faint moonlight outside cast a pale glow, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement in the reflection, a shadow darting across the room. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Shaking my head, I decided to check the atelier. I told myself it was just to make sure I hadn't left any paints or brushes out to dry. In truth, I wanted to reassure myself that everything was as it should be. The atelier was on the east side of the house, and as I entered, the room felt colder than the rest. The moonlight streamed through the large windows, casting long, thin shadows on the floor. My easel stood near the center, surrounded by unfinished canvases. The air smelled of turpentine and varnish, sharp and bitter. I glanced around, my eyes landing on the door at the back of the room. It was open just a crack. A wave of unease washed over me. I was certain I had closed that door earlier. The door led to the basement, a space I had avoided since moving in. The thought of going down there at night made my skin crawl. Maybe I forgot to shut it, I murmured, trying to convince myself. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. I approached the door slowly, every step feeling heavier than the last. My hand trembled as I pushed it open. The narrow staircase leading down to the basement was cloaked in darkness. The air that wafted up was stale, carrying a faint metallic scent that made my stomach churn. Gripping a small flashlight, I stepped onto the first creaking step. The beam of light illuminated the stone walls and the clutter of old furniture and crates that filled the basement. My footsteps echoed in the silence, each one louder than the last. I didn't know what I was looking for, maybe just some reassurance that there was nothing down there. But as I scanned the room, the flashlight's beam landed on something that made my breath catch. In the far corner of the basement, leaning against the wall, was a large canvas, partially covered by a thick, dusty cloth. I hadn't noticed it before, and I had no idea why it was there. Curiosity tugged at me, stronger than the fear gnawing at my gut. I approached the canvas, coughing as I pulled the cloth away. A cloud of dust billowed into the air, making my eyes water. What lay beneath the cloth was a portrait, a man painted from the chest up. His hair was dark, streaked with gray near the temples, and his expression was intense. The eyes, though unfinished, seemed to follow me, their stare penetrating even in their incomplete state. The background was a murky gray, and the man's suit was no more than rough strokes of dark paint. Yet, despite its incompleteness, the portrait exuded a strange energy, an almost suffocating presence. I couldn't look away. The longer I stared, the more details I noticed. The tension around the man's mouth, the sharpness of his jawline, the unfinished lines that hinted at a deeper story. My skin prickled as I reached out to touch the canvas. The surface was rough and cold, sending a shiver down my spine. I didn't know why, but I felt compelled to take the painting upstairs. The canvas was heavier than I expected, and my arms ached as I hauled it up the narrow steps. My breathing was labored by the time I reached the atelier. I leaned the painting against the wall near my easel and switched on the overhead light. Under the artificial glow, the portrait looked darker, more menacing. The man's expression seemed almost grim, his eyes filled with a silent accusation. I stared at it for what felt like hours, trying to understand why it made me feel so uneasy. The air in the room felt heavier, colder. My chest tightened, and a faint headache began to form. I tried to tell myself it was just a painting, nothing more. But as I stood there, staring into those intense, unfinished eyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had brought something into the house that didn't belong, something that had been waiting, hidden in the shadows, for someone like me to set it free. The portrait didn't let me sleep. I lay in bed, tossing and turning, my thoughts circling around the man in the painting. His eyes, unfinished yet unsettlingly alive, burned into my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them staring back at me. By the time dawn broke, I had given up on the idea of rest. The pale light seeped through the curtains, and with it came the faint chirping of birds. The house, usually filled with groans and creaks, was eerily silent. I trudged to the kitchen, hoping coffee would jolt me into some semblance of clarity. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, but it did little to ease the tension coiled in my chest. My mind kept drifting back to the painting and the unease it had stirred in me. After finishing my coffee, I decided to distract myself with work. I headed to the atelier, determined to ignore the portrait leaning against the wall. I positioned myself at the easel, picked up a brush, and began working on a piece I had started earlier, a landscape of the forest surrounding the house. But my focus was fractured. My gaze kept flickering toward the portrait, as if it demanded my attention. Finally, I gave in. I set my brush down and approached the painting. It seemed even darker in the morning light, the unfinished strokes taking on an almost sinister quality. The man's expression was unreadable, his eyes still incomplete but somehow aware. As I studied the painting, I noticed something I hadn't the night before, a faint, almost imperceptible texture beneath the layers of paint. I leaned closer, running my fingers over the surface. The texture felt like ridges, forming a pattern hidden beneath the strokes of color. Curiosity got the better of me. I fetched a palette knife and gently scraped at a small section of the painting, careful not to damage it. The paint came away in thin layers, revealing what looked like faint symbols etched into the canvas. I froze, the blade of the palette knife trembling in my hand. The symbols were intricate and unfamiliar, their shapes twisting and looping in ways that made my head spin. They reminded me of something ancient, something that didn't belong in this time, or in this house. A sudden chill swept through the room, raising goosebumps on my arms. The air grew heavy, pressing down on me like an invisible weight. I stepped back, my breath hitching in my throat. "What is this?" I whispered, though no one was there to answer. I didn't have the courage to scrape away more paint, not yet. Instead, I covered the painting with a sheet and turned back to my easel. But the distraction I sought was impossible. The symbols, the man's face, the oppressive feeling in the room, it all clawed at my mind. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking, that the unease was just my imagination. But as evening fell, the house seemed to close in around me, its silence growing louder, more oppressive. When night came, I found myself staring at the door to the basement. Something about it felt different. The air around it seemed colder, and the shadows pooling at its edges felt unnaturally dark. I wanted to ignore it, to stay in the warmth of the living room with the TV on for company, but something compelled me to investigate. Armed with my flashlight, I descended the stairs. The smell of damp stone and aged wood hit me as I reached the bottom. The basement was just as I had left it, cluttered with old furniture and forgotten crates. But the atmosphere was different. It felt alive. I scanned the room with the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. My eyes landed on a stack of old books piled haphazardly in one corner. They hadn't caught my attention before, but now they seemed to call to me, much like the painting had. I approached the pile and picked up the top book. Its leather cover was cracked and brittle, the title faded beyond recognition. When I opened it, the pages felt like they would crumble in my hands. The text was handwritten in a language I couldn't understand, filled with the same symbols I had seen beneath the paint. As I flipped through the pages, a sense of dread settled over me. The words felt heavy, as if they carried a meaning beyond comprehension. I couldn't read them, but I could feel them, their weight pressing against my mind. I quickly set the book down, my hands shaking. The basement felt colder now, the shadows deeper. I needed to leave, to get out of that suffocating space. But as I turned to head back up the stairs, I heard it. A faint whisper, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. It came from behind me. My heart raced as I slowly turned, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The beam landed on the far wall, where a large, rusted mirror hung crookedly. The glass was warped and speckled with age, but as I stared into it, I thought I saw movement. I took a hesitant step closer, my reflection coming into view. At first, it was just me, pale and wide-eyed, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. But then behind me, something shifted. A shadow moved, indistinct and fleeting, but unmistakable. I spun around, the flashlight darting across the room. Nothing. The basement was empty, save for the furniture and crates. But when I turned back to the mirror, the shadow was still there, closer now, looming behind my reflection. My chest tightened as I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. The whispering grew louder, a cacophony of voices that I couldn't understand. My head throbbed, the pressure building until it felt like it would burst. Without thinking, I bolted up the stairs, my feet barely touching the steps. I slammed the basement door shut behind me, leaning against it as I tried to catch my breath. The whispers were gone, replaced by the oppressive silence of the house. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the living room, the lights on, my ears straining for any sound. The painting remained covered in the atelier, but its presence weighed on me, as if it were watching me through the walls. Morning came, but the sunlight brought no comfort. I knew I couldn't ignore what was happening. The painting, the symbols, the shadows in the mirror, none of it was coincidence. There was something wrong with this house, something that had been waiting for me to uncover it. Determined to find answers, I spent the day researching. I scoured the internet for anything about the house or the painting, but the search turned up nothing useful. Frustration mounted as I realized I was on my own. Then, as I was about to give up, I found an old article buried in the archives of a local newspaper. The headline sent a chill down my spine. The vanishing of James Harrow, mysterious disappearance leaves town baffled. The article detailed the story of James Harrow, a reclusive artist who had lived in the house over a century ago. He was known for his haunting portraits, but one day, he vanished without a trace, leaving behind only his unfinished work. The painting in my atelier. My blood ran cold as I read on. According to the article, Harrow had been obsessed with the idea of capturing a person's soul in his art. Some believed his disappearance was the result of a ritual gone wrong, though no evidence was ever found. The symbols on the canvas, The whispers, the shadow in the mirror. Everything began to fall into place, and the realization sent a wave of terror through me. The painting wasn't just art. It was a gateway, a vessel for something far darker than I could comprehend. As night fell, the house grew colder, the air heavier. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't know what. The portrait remained in the atelier, its presence like a weight on my chest. And then, as the clock struck midnight, I heard it again. The faint sound of footsteps. They weren't coming from the basement this time. They were coming from the atelier. The footsteps in the atelier sent a jolt through me, my heart hammering against my ribs. They were slow and deliberate, each step reverberating in the silence of the house. I froze, the weight of the moment pinning me to the spot. Every fiber of my being screamed to run, to leave the house and never look back. But something stronger, whether it was fear, curiosity, or the pull of the painting, drew me toward the sound. I grabbed the flashlight and a fire poker from the hearth, clutching it tightly as I made my way to the atelier. The hallway stretched before me, impossibly long, the shadows at its edges seeming to ripple and shift. The door to the atelier was ajar, a thin sliver of light spilling out into the hallway. I stepped closer, my breath shallow and uneven. With each step, the air grew heavier, colder, until it felt like I was wading through water. I pushed the door open, my flashlight beam slicing through the dimly lit room. The painting stood in the center of the atelier, no longer leaning against the wall but propped upright on an easel. The sheet I had used to cover it lay crumpled on the floor. The man in the portrait was different now. His eyes were no longer unfinished. They were complete, piercing, and unnervingly real. They locked onto mine, and I felt an electric charge shoot through me, as if the painting itself was alive. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The air around the painting seemed to ripple, the faint whispering from the basement returning. Louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus, a symphony of overlapping murmurs that made my head throb. I stepped closer, compelled by a force I couldn't resist. The symbols beneath the layers of paint seemed to pulse, glowing faintly as if alive. I reached out a trembling hand, my fingers inches from the surface of the canvas. And then, the room shifted. The walls seemed to melt away, replaced by an endless void of darkness. I was no longer in the atelier, but standing in a vast, featureless expanse. The painting was still before me, its frame hovering in the air, the man's eyes glowing like embers. "James Harrow," a voice boomed, deep and resonant, filling the void. I turned, searching for the source, but there was nothing, just darkness stretching in all directions. "Why are you here?" the voice demanded. I don't know," I stammered, clutching the fire poker as if it could protect me. "I found the painting. It was in the house when I moved in." The man in the painting seemed to smirk, his expression shifting in a way that made my stomach churn. "You are not here by chance," the voice said. "You were chosen." "Chosen for what?" I shouted, my fear giving way to anger. "I didn't ask for this." The void trembled, and the whispers grew deafening. Images flashed before my eyes. James Harrow standing before an easel, his hands covered in paint, the symbols glowing on the canvas. I saw him chanting, his voice blending with the whispers, the air around him rippling with dark energy. He wasn't just an artist. He was a conduit, a gateway for something ancient and malevolent. The vision shifted, showing Harrow's final moments. The painting had turned on him, its dark power consuming him as he screamed, his body dissolving into the canvas. "You must finish what he began," the voice said, its tone heavy with finality. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I won't. I don't even know what this is." The painting began to glow, the symbols pulsating with a sinister energy. The man's eyes bore into mine, and I felt a pull, like invisible hands dragging me toward the canvas. "You cannot escape your destiny," the voice intoned. "I don't want this destiny," I shouted, struggling against the pull, but the force was too strong. My hands were drawn to the canvas, and as my fingers touched its surface, a shock of energy surged through me. I was no longer in control. My body moved of its own accord, picking up a brush and dipping it into a palette that appeared out of nowhere. The whispers guided my hand, the brush moving with precision I had never known. I painted over the symbols, each stroke sealing them into the canvas, their glow fading. The man's expression shifted with every stroke, his smirk growing wider, more sinister. I could feel his power growing, the air around me vibrating with a malevolent energy. "You are completing the circle," the voice said, now coming from the man in the painting. "No!" I screamed, fighting to regain control of my body. With every ounce of strength I had left, I wrenched my hand away from the canvas. The brush clattered to the ground, and the whispers stopped abruptly. The void began to collapse, the darkness folding in on itself. The man in the painting glared at me, his eyes burning with fury. "You cannot defy me," he roared, his voice shaking the very fabric of the void. "I can try," I muttered, grabbing the fire poker. I plunged it into the canvas with all my strength. The painting erupted in a burst of light and shadow, the man's scream echoing in my ears. The void shattered, and I was thrown backward, landing hard on the floor of the atelier. When I opened my eyes, the painting was gone. The easel was empty, the sheet still crumpled on the floor. The room was silent, the oppressive weight lifted. I sat there for what felt like hours, my body trembling, my mind struggling to process what had happened. The whispers were gone, the shadows no longer lurking in the corners. I don't know how long I stayed in that position, but eventually I forced myself to move. I gathered the remains of the painting, now just a pile of ash, and took them outside. I burned them in the fire pit, watching as the last remnants of James Harrow's dark legacy turned to smoke and disappeared into the sky. The house felt different after that, lighter, almost welcoming. The oppressive silence was replaced by the normal creaks and groans of an old house. But I couldn't stay. The memories of what had happened were too vivid, too haunting. I packed my belongings and left the house the next morning, leaving behind the atelier, the basement, and all the questions that would never be answered. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, I thought I saw the man from the painting standing in the window, watching me leave. But when I blinked, he was gone. Hi there. My name's Elwood, but everyone calls me Woody. I'm 10 years old, and I've got a story that'll make you think twice about leaving your bedroom door open at night. It happened last summer, right after we moved into a new house in a quiet neighborhood called Maple Hollow. I never thought much about the place. Just a typical old house with creaky floors and windows that rattled in the wind. But it turns out the house had secrets. First, let me introduce you to my family. There's my mom, Beatrix, who works late shifts at the hospital. She always smells like lavender and peppermint because of her hand lotion. My dad, Harlan, travels a lot for work, selling some kind of machinery I never really understood. Then there's my little sister, Juniper, who's 7 and obsessed with collecting shiny rocks. Oh, and we have a cat named Cricket. She's black with one white paw and always seems to be staring at something that isn't there. The first weird thing happened the night after we moved in. I was lying in bed, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars I had stuck on the ceiling, when I heard a soft noise. It wasn't loud, just a faint, scratchy sound, like someone dragging their fingers along the wall. I figured it was just the house settling or maybe the wind. But then Cricket, who was curled up at the foot of my bed, lifted her head and stared at the door. Her fur puffed up and she let out a low, warning growl. I'd never heard her do that before. I got up, opened the door, and peeked into the hallway. Nothing. Just shadows and the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I shrugged it off and went back to bed, pulling the blanket up to my chin. A few nights later, I woke up at exactly 3:17 a.m. Don't ask me why. I just did. It felt like something had tugged me out of sleep. I reached for my phone to check the time, and that's when I noticed Cricket wasn't on the bed. I sat up, rubbing my eyes. The room was quiet. Too quiet. No crickets chirping outside, no rustling leaves. Just silence. I was about to lie back down when I heard it again. The soft, scratchy noise. This time it was coming from the closet. I froze. My closet door was closed. Always. I never left it open because, well, closets are creepy. But now, it looked like it was slightly open, just a crack. "Cricket?" I whispered. No answer. I grabbed my flashlight from the nightstand and shone it toward the closet. The light hit the door, making it look even creepier. I wanted to call for my mom, but something told me not to. Instead, I tiptoed across the room, gripping the flashlight tightly. As I got closer to the closet, I heard a whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was there, just barely audible. "I've been waiting." I froze. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might explode. Who was waiting? For what? I took a deep breath and yanked the closet door open, shining my flashlight inside. Nothing. Just my clothes, some boxes, and Cricket, sitting on the top shelf, staring down at me with those glowing yellow eyes. I let out a shaky laugh. "Really, Cricket? You scared me half to death." She didn't move, just kept staring. The next morning I told Juniper about it. She thought it was hilarious. "Maybe the house is haunted," she said, eyes wide with excitement. "Yeah, right," I muttered, stuffing a spoonful of cereal into my mouth. But that night, it happened again. This time, the noise was louder, and the whisper came from near the window. "Woody, are you awake?" I shot up in bed, grabbing my flashlight. My heart was racing, but I didn't move. The voice wasn't scary exactly. It was calm, almost gentle. But it wasn't right. "I know you can hear me," it said again. I shone the flashlight toward the window, but nothing was there. Just the curtains swaying slightly in the breeze. By now, I was terrified. I told my mom, but she just said I was probably having bad dreams. Dad wasn't home, so he couldn't help. Juniper thought it was the coolest thing ever and wanted to camp out in my room to see the ghost. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat up in bed, flashlight in one hand and a baseball bat in the other. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the whisper came again. "I'm here, Woody. Let's play." The closet door creaked open on its own. I didn't wait. I swung the bat as hard as I could, hitting the door with a loud thud. The whisper stopped. When I looked inside, there was nothing. But on the floor, where Cricket had been, was a single shiny rock. We moved out a week later. Mom said it was because of a job offer in another city, but I knew the real reason. The house didn't want us there. Now, every night, I keep my closet door closed and my flashlight within reach. And if I ever hear a whisper again, I know exactly what to do. Keep your doors closed, friends, and always listen to your pets. They know things. I still wake up sometimes, heart pounding, blankets tangled around me, thinking about the time I went camping at Crow Hollow. I know what happened that weekend wasn't a dream because I was wide awake. I can feel it even now, like a shiver under my skin. My best friend Simon and I were just looking for a quiet getaway, but Crow Hollow gave us more than we ever wanted. Simon and I have been friends since middle school. He's the kind of guy who always has a backup plan, a flashlight in every bag, and knows how to start a fire with just 2 sticks. Me? I'm Jace. I handle the food and make sure we don't forget to bring marshmallows. We'd been camping before, but this trip was going to be special. Crow Hollow had a reputation. People said the stars were brighter there, and the air was crisp and cool, perfect for sleeping under the trees. We left early on a Friday morning. Simon was driving his old Jeep, humming along to the radio. Crow Hollow was about 4 hours away, and we spent most of the drive talking about what we'd do. Fishing, hiking, maybe finding a good spot to take pictures of the stars. When we got there, the parking lot was empty, except for an old, rusty van with flat tires. It didn't look like it had moved in years. Simon checked his phone for a weather update. "Clear skies all weekend," he said with a grin. "Perfect." The trail started easy, winding through big trees that smelled like rain and pine needles. The ground was soft and damp, and we could hear a river nearby. After about an hour of walking, we found the perfect clearing. "This'll work," Simon said, dropping his pack. The spot was surrounded by tall trees, and the ground was flat enough for our tent. We set up camp quickly. Simon handled the tent, and I gathered sticks for the fire. We worked together like we always did. By the time the sun started setting, our little camp felt cozy and ready for the night. We cooked hot dogs over the fire and sat in our camping chairs, watching the flames dance. The sky turned pink and orange before fading to a deep blue. Stars started to pop out, one by one. It was quiet, except for the crackling fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. Simon leaned back in his chair, staring at the sky. "This is perfect," he said. I nodded, poking at the fire with a stick, but something felt different. I couldn't explain it. Just a little too quiet, maybe. That's when I noticed it. Our chairs had been moved, not a little bit, completely turned around, facing the trees instead of the fire. "Did you do that?" I asked Simon. He shook his head. "Nope. Must have been the wind." He got up and turned his chair back around. But there was no wind. I shrugged it off. Maybe we were just tired. We told stories, laughed, and roasted marshmallows until the fire died down. Around 9 o'clock, Simon froze mid-sentence. "Did you hear that?" I stopped chewing my marshmallow and listened. At first, I heard nothing. Then, faintly, there were voices. They were too far away to understand, but they were definitely there. "Hello?" Simon called out. No answer. We sat in silence, waiting. The voices stopped. "Probably other campers," I said, even though I didn't believe it. We hadn't seen anyone else all day. Simon nodded, but his eyes were serious. "Let's just keep the fire going." The night dragged on. The temperature dropped, and we wrapped ourselves in blankets. The fire was just embers when we decided to go to bed. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps, crunching leaves outside our tent. "Chase," Simon whispered. He was sitting up, staring at the tent wall. "Someone's out there." I held my breath and listened. The footsteps circled the tent, once, twice, then stopped right at the entrance. A shadow fell across the tent, tall and thin, just standing there. I grabbed the small knife I kept in my pack. My hands were shaking. We waited, frozen, until the shadow moved away. "We need to check outside," Simon whispered. "No way," I hissed back. "What if it's still out there?" Simon was already unzipping the tent. He peeked out, shining his flashlight around. The clearing was empty. Everything looked normal. But then he found it. A single footprint, bigger than any shoe I'd ever seen. We stayed up the rest of the night, sitting back to back, knives in hand. The voices came back around 3 a.m., closer this time. They sounded like they were arguing, but we couldn't make out any words. Shadows moved outside the tent, tall and strange. When the first light of dawn broke, we packed up and left. We didn't stop until we were back at the Jeep. Simon and I never talked about what happened that night, not really. But we haven't been back to Crow Hollow. Some places are better left alone, and some stories are better left untold. Hi, my name is Callum. I just turned 11, and I've got a story that's going to keep you up tonight. But don't worry. If you stay quiet and listen carefully, maybe the man in my story won't come looking for you. It all started when my mom and I moved into a new house. We had to move because my mom got a new job in another town, far from where we used to live. Our new place wasn't very big, but it felt cozy. There were only 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living room with a giant window. You could see everything from that window: the street, the trees, and even a small playground at the end of the block. Mom was happy because the rent wasn't too high, and I was happy because I finally got my own room. I spent the first few days unpacking my stuff and trying to make my room feel like home. It was quiet in our new neighborhood, which was nice. I wasn't used to that. Back in our old place, you could hear cars honking and people yelling at all hours. One evening after dinner, I was lying on the couch playing a game on my phone. The sun had just set and the sky was a deep orange. I looked out the big window and saw something weird. Across the street, standing by the window of another house, was a man. He was tall, with a thin face, and he wore shiny glasses that reflected the street lights. He wasn't moving, just standing there holding binoculars, and those binoculars were pointed right at me. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Maybe he was looking at something else. I tried not to make it a big deal. I pulled the curtain shut and went back to my game. The next night, the same thing happened. I had just come home from school, tossed my backpack onto the floor, and sat down to eat some cereal. I glanced out the window and there he was again. The same man, in the same spot, holding his binoculars. This time, I was sure he was looking at me. I told my mom about it, but she just laughed and said I was probably tired from all the moving. Maybe he's a bird watcher, she joked. But I wasn't laughing. The way he stood there so still, with that blank look on his face, it felt wrong. After a few days, it became a routine. Every night, I would peek out the window, and there he'd be, always watching. I tried everything, closing the blinds, turning off the lights, but I could still feel his eyes on me. It was like he knew when I was looking. One night, I decided I had enough. I pulled the curtain open and stared right back at him. My heart was pounding, but I didn't look away. I wanted him to know I wasn't scared. But then, he did something that made my stomach twist. He smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was crooked, like he was enjoying a secret that I didn't know. I slammed the curtain shut and ran to my room. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I told my friend Arlen about it. Arlen's the kind of kid who never gets scared. He's always climbing trees and jumping off high places like it's no big deal. Maybe he's a ghost, Arlen said, laughing. But I didn't laugh. That night, something different happened. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard a sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window. I didn't want to look, but I had to. When I peeked through the curtain, the man wasn't across the street anymore. He was standing right outside my window, looking up at me. He didn't have the binoculars this time, just his shiny glasses, catching the light from the street lamp. I backed away from the window and ran to my mom's room. "Mom, he's outside," I whispered, shaking her awake. She didn't believe me at first, but when she heard the tapping, her face went pale. She called the police, and I stayed in her room, hiding under the blankets. I heard the officers talking outside. When they came in, they said the man was gone. They searched the area but didn't find him. After that night, we kept all the windows locked and the curtains closed. But I still felt him watching. Every time I walked to school or played outside, I felt those shiny glasses somewhere in the distance. We moved again a few months later. Mom said it was because of her job, but I knew the real reason. She didn't want to stay in that house anymore. Neither did I. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I think about the man with the shiny glasses. I wonder where he went. Maybe he found someone else to watch. Maybe he's watching you right now. Hi, my name is Kent. I'm 12 years old and I love adventure, especially when it's just me, nature, and the great outdoors. Ever since I can remember, I've been going on camping trips with my dad. He taught me how to build a fire, pitch a tent, and listen to the quiet sounds of the forest. But this story isn't about a trip with Dad. This one, well, it's the kind that sticks with you. It happened last fall, just before the first frost. I decided to go camping alone at Whispering Pond. My mom didn't love the idea, but after lots of promises and extra check-ins, she finally agreed. Whispering Pond isn't too far from our town, but it's one of those hidden spots that not many people know about. You have to hike through a thick trail or paddle across the water to get to the good camping spots. I loaded up my gear, took our old kayak, and paddled across the pond. The water was still and quiet, reflecting the trees like glass. The air smelled fresh, with that cool bite that lets you know winter isn't far off. I paddled to the far side, where there's a little clearing. I've camped there a few times with Dad, but this time, it was just me. After pulling the kayak onto the shore, I set up my tent under a big oak tree. It felt good to be out there, away from everything. No cars, no phones buzzing, just peace and quiet. I gathered some sticks and branches for the fire and soon had a small flame going. Dinner was simple, just hot dogs and marshmallows. I sat by the fire watching the sun dip lower until it was just a soft glow on the horizon. The sky turned dark, and the stars started to twinkle. I lay back on my sleeping bag, listening to the soft rustling of leaves and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. It felt good, peaceful. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke up suddenly. At first I wasn't sure why. The fire was just glowing embers now, and the forest was still. Then I heard it. A soft splash. Just one. It came from the water. My first thought was that a fish had jumped. I sat up and listened. Another splash. And another. It wasn't random like a fish. It was steady, like someone paddling. My heart started to beat a little faster. I unzipped the tent a little and peeked out. The moon was bright, lighting up the pond. Everything looked silver and calm. But then, I saw it. A boat. It was small, maybe a rowboat or a canoe. I couldn't see it clearly, just a dark shape gliding across the water. It didn't have any lights, no headlamp, no lantern, just a shadow moving silently. I squinted, trying to see who was inside. The boat was still too far to make out details, but I could tell someone was paddling. The weird thing? There was no sound except for the water, no talking, no rustling. Just the steady dip of the paddle. I told myself it was probably someone else camping. Maybe they were out for a night paddle. But something about it felt off. The boat wasn't heading toward the shore or any campsite. It was just drifting, and it was coming closer. I stayed still, barely breathing. The boat drifted closer, and now I could see the outline of the person inside. They were hunched over, paddling slowly. No headlamp, no flashlight, just a dark figure. The boat stopped. It was about 30 feet from the shore, floating quietly. The person sat there, facing my tent, not moving, just watching. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to run, but where? The only trail was near the water. I thought about shining my flashlight, but what if that made things worse? What if they came closer? Minutes passed. The person didn't move. They just sat there, as if they were waiting for something. Then, without warning, they stood up. The boat rocked, but they stayed steady. They reached down and picked up something long and thin. I couldn't tell what it was. A paddle? A stick? They held it for a moment, then threw it into the water with a splash. I flinched. My whole body was tense. The person sat back down, picked up the paddle, and started moving again. This time they paddled away, slowly, silently, back across the pond. I didn't move until the sound of the splashing faded completely. I didn't sleep after that. I just sat in my tent, holding my flashlight, waiting for dawn. When the first light broke through the trees, I packed up as fast as I could. The pond looked calm and empty, like nothing had happened. But as I walked to the shore to load my kayak, I saw it, a long stick, floating near the edge. It was stripped of bark and sharpened at one end, like a spear. I didn't touch it. I didn't even stop to think. I just got in the kayak and paddled back across the pond, my eyes scanning the water the whole time. When I reached the car, I finally felt like I could breathe again. I don't know who was out there that night or what they wanted, but I do know one thing. Whispering Pond isn't as quiet as it seems, and sometimes the silence hides more than you think. Would I ever go back? Not alone. Never alone.